Our next speaker is Daniel Tse, who is one of our IH teachers. Before going into ELT, Daniel trained and taught as a classical musician. He now teaches English across all ages and levels, and today he's going to talk to us about practical materials light language practice ideas for the online classroom, something that's going to be interesting for most of us now. So, welcome, Daniel. I'm going to turn off my video.
Right, thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon and a warm welcome. So, in this session, we're going to explore 5 materials light ideas for language practice. And I'm thinking specifically about the online classroom. As you know, things have changed suddenly back in March, when most teachers suddenly found themselves giving lessons remotely. And our primary contact with others were made through a flat screen. And for those of us who are already used to the face-to-face context, it could feel like starting everything from scratch when it comes to planning and teaching. Now, as we're on this, I'd like you to answer 2 questions in the chat. Here comes the first one. Are you still teaching online classes? Right, so almost all of you says yes. Not yet. Right, thank you. Now, the second question, what's the average size of your online classes if you're teaching online? Right, 15, 1-to-1, 20, 30, that's a large class. Thanks a lot. So whether you're teaching smaller or larger classes online, I hope by the end of this session, you'll have gained some extra ideas for running materials light practice in your lessons. And these ideas can empower your teaching and your students' learning. And if you've already been using some of them in your classroom, that's brilliant. Now, everyone loves a good story, don't they? I'd just like to tell you my story very briefly. And I'd like to start by going back to March this year. When I first shifted my lessons online, I was relying heavily on PowerPoint, task cards, scanned coursebook pages, and somehow there were always teacher-generated materials here and there. And one day I thought, if I was able to apply the principle of materials light teaching to the face-to-face context, there must be a way I could do the same with my online lessons. And that's my story for this session. Now, some of you might be asking this question, what do you mean by materials light? You might be able to guess it already from my story. I'm using materials light as the antithesis of materials heavy or materials intensive, like creating worksheet exercises, preparing task cards for role plays, or setting up information cards for a discussion activity. Now, I'm not suggesting that we don't use materials at all. We need them. But by cutting down on the amount of teacher-generated materials, it liberates us in the planning process. We can make use of our students as planning resources. At the same time, we're not sacrificing their learning with materials light teaching. We're aiming for them to achieve the same learning goals. And we may even find ourselves spending less time in front of a computer screen, which I certainly need, and our students are getting more engaged in their lessons. That's because we're involving them in the decision-making process of their own learning. So, without further ado, here comes the first activity. Let's say your students are learning the third conditional. We're assuming that you've clarified this grammar point in context and your students know how and when to use it already. At this stage, you're going to use a sentence construction exercise because you like your students to work on their oral accuracy. Now, there are two clauses in the third conditional, aren't there? The conditional clause starting with if and the main clause. So, using the context of regrets, first, I'd like each of you to come up with two conditional clauses and two main clauses. In other words, prepare two sets of sentence halves in the third conditional. Now, as we haven't got breakout rooms on Zoom webinars, we'll use the chat to imitate pair work. I'd like to ask each of you to pick a color first, red or blue. Right, so the colors are coming in. So feel free to pick a color. Right, thank you. Now I'm going to ask you to remember your choice. So for the red group, can I ask you to type one of your clauses in the chat? Can either be the conditional or the main clause. Right, so when you're ready, red group, you can type an example. Right, so I'm seeing the third conditional and some other types as well. Excellent, thank you. Now, I'm going to ask the blue group. Go to the chat, choose one example, and complete the sentence in the third conditional, please. So you're writing two clauses, the whole sentence. Right, thank you. Excellent. So I'm seeing some very good examples here in the third conditional. Right, so that's the idea. If we use breakout rooms for this activity, you can ask your students to work in pairs, tell each other their clauses orally, and complete the partners ones with their own ideas. So it looks like this. The red group, the blue group, and then they're completing the sentences orally. Now, earlier, I asked you to write two sets of clauses as an example, but you can extend this activity depending on the class you're teaching. As a following up, each pair of students can choose one of their sentences to present in open class. And you can ask your students to have a vote on the most creative one. As you can see, we've added an interactive element to a sentence construction exercise, and we've gone further to personalize it for our students. When they're completing their partner's clauses, there's the opportunity for them to restructure language. So it's a kind of peer-to-peer correction, we can say. Finally, there's the benefit of differentiation, because you've got stronger students who can come up with more complex sentences, whereas the weaker ones, they can still come up with shorter clauses. So we're maximizing the chance of every student completing this activity successfully, and they'll feel a sense of achievement from this. So to sum up, I'll say this activity should work with any two-part grammatical structures, and you can simply adapt it for the one you're teaching. Another activity is an interactive quiz, which I used with one of my teens groups. Now, I'm sure the word motivation isn't anything remote when we're talking about teaching teenagers, right? And so, instead of giving them ready-made quiz questions, I divided my students into two groups, and I asked each group to create their own quiz about the natural world. So that's the context. There was a condition though. They had to use the lesson's grammar point, the passive. When my students were ready and I checked their quiz questions, I paired them up so that the two teams of students could test each other. Now, guess how my students reacted to this activity at first? Maybe it's an overstatement, but some of them were gobsmacked. No, I wasn't asking them to start writing the quiz from scratch, of course. And I actually showed them the coursebook exercise, which we've been doing in the lesson. So my students could use that coursebook exercise as a task model. I also told them they could use the internet to research answers to their quiz questions. Immediately, I saw my students getting their hands on the task. And above all, they're using the passive to do something meaningful. One of the great things about the internet is that it trains teenagers to become less dependent on others when they want to find answers to their questions. Instead, they have to look for information themselves and process it with a critical mind. Does it come from a reputable source? Is it up to date or something from a decade ago? And I think it's more important than ever, since we're living in an age of widespread disinformation or fake news. Of course, I couldn't tell whether my students resorted to their first language on the internet, but they'll still be using the passive in English. And that's the whole point. As you can see, there's preparation involved in running this activity. And since the students are the ones who come up with practice materials, it is their practice activity. It's created by them. The result is that they'll feel a sense of ownership, if that's the right word, and get more engaged in the lesson. Now, I'm aware we've been looking at grammar practice in the last two activities, and they're accuracy-oriented. So let's talk about fluency at the other end of the continuum, and we'll explore the next activity now. To start with, I was going to show you a photo about an object. But since I'm sticking to the principle of materials-light teaching, I'm going to draw it instead. And for this session, I've recorded myself doing that on the computer as if I was teaching online. So I'm going to show you the video. If you know what it is, please type it in the chat. Right. So feel free to type in the chat. What's this object? Right, thank you. Hot air balloon, well done. None of you said light bulb. I'm glad. So it's a hot air balloon. Now, I'm going to tell you something about this hot air balloon. It's not any other balloon because this one can take us to a new planet. And there on this planet, we can set up a whole new world. Intriguing, isn't it? Before we do something with this hot air balloon, you can ask your students to work in small groups. They have to brainstorm 10 types of jobs or professions. The assumption is that they've already got the necessary vocabulary for this activity. Otherwise, you'll have to pre-teach it first. Back in open class, you can elicit 10 types of jobs. And don't worry, if you've got more than 10, you can always ask your students to vote on removing the extra ones. And if there are only 6 or 7, then you can convey some types of jobs and elicit them from your students. Now, let's go back to the hot air balloon, shall we? I'm afraid there's a slight problem. The balloon can take only 7 people representing different types of jobs. 7, not 10. Oh no. At this point, your students have to negotiate, discuss, and reach an agreement among themselves. Who are they going to choose? Who are they going to leave behind? These are the questions they have to solve. And as a following up, so extension, you can also ask your students to reflect on their choices in a further discussion. So let them talk about how their choices would affect the way societies work on the new planet. On first reading, this activity seems to be a kind of fluency practice on vocabulary, doesn't it? Because we're talking about 10 types of jobs here. But you can actually exploit it in various ways. Let's say if you want to stick to grammar practice, you can focus on will and going to for talking about decisions. So which 7 people your students are going to choose for the hot air balloon. In the follow-up discussion, you can also focus on will and going to for talking about future predictions. So the students exchange their ideas about how their choices will affect the future of the new planet. That's just one example. And if you're already getting a bit drunk with grammar at this point, this discussion activity is also well suited for speaking skills practice. Because what we've really got here is a problem-solving discussion. So we set a problem for our students, and in order to solve it, they have to use a set of communication skills to achieve the objective. They have to agree or disagree with each other, give and justify their opinions, and offer a compromise in order to reach an agreement. In fact, you can use this activity to develop your students' oral fluency as well as communication skills. Right. I've got some minutes left, so enough time to share 2 further ideas with you. The next activity focuses on spoken functions. When we talk about functional language, we think of using it in real life to achieve certain communicative purposes. And there are skills and strategies we can develop in our students. A key area of communication is cultural sensitivity. And I'll say the idea of politeness plays a large part in this. Now, different cultures interpret this idea of politeness in slightly different ways. For example, what's regarded as sufficiently polite in one country, and when we apply it elsewhere, we might actually get a very different kind of reception. So forgive the British humor in this cartoon, but you see the point. And if you've ever paid close attention to how people interact with each other, you see the idea of politeness isn't only defined by cultural boundaries. In fact, it happens even within the same culture. What do I mean by that? So let's think about 2 different situations as examples. In the first one, you're buying a cup of tea at a busy train station. You'll probably ask, "A large tea, please." Whereas if you're at the post office collecting a parcel, you'll probably ask, "Could I collect my parcel, please?" Now, let's go back to the first situation again. Imagine if I say this, "Would you be so kind as to make me a cup of tea?" This is polite, but too polite, and it's going to make people think I was being sarcastic with them. After all, it's not an appropriate way of making a polite request, is it? So this has led the linguist Del Himes to coin the word appropriacy. In layman's terms, we're thinking about what language is appropriate in a specific situation, and it depends very much on who we're talking with. In language classrooms, we often use role plays to practice functional language. But how can we make them materials light? Again, we can ask our students to come up with a few situations. All we're doing here is deconstruct the process of materials creation and apply it to our lessons. Using my examples earlier, let's focus on the function of making polite requests. Assuming you've already clarified the language for your students, first, you can ask them to work in groups. They brainstorm a few scenarios where people need to make requests. At this stage, they'll have to think about the relationship between 2 speakers, the specific reason for such a request, and most importantly, the context or the occasion. Is it a busy train station, or is it at the post office? Or even maybe in English lessons in your classrooms? Ideally, the scenarios should cover the entire spectrum of informal and formal relationships. Once you've elicited a few scenarios and fine-tuned them, the students can start practicing and acting them out in pairs. In each scenario, you can also ask your students to explore intonation patterns. For example, buying a cup of tea in a hurry, or when they're not in a rush, or even doing the same because they've been given a cuppa with too much milk in it. So we're asking our students to think more thoroughly about language, and specifically the connection between intonation and functional use in communicative contexts. In other words, we're not altering intonation just for the sake of contrast in this type of practice activities. Now, after the role play, you can nominate some students to act out the scenarios in open class. So, if we develop the communicative competence of our students in this way, we trust they'll be able to handle interactions in real-life situations more confidently. For the final activity, we're going to move on to pronunciation. As you know, there's no regular relationship between spelling and pronunciation in English. I used to think I was utterly hopeless with the French language until I realized the same goes for English. So there are quite a few English words with a GH spelling, or technically OUGH, on there. So as you can see, cough with the F sound, although with the O sound, through with the U sound, plow with the OW sound, bought with the O sound, borough, and I'm thinking about the UK pronunciation, with the schwa sound. Loughborough, a town in England, with the f and the schwa sound. And it doesn't end there. So with such a diverse set of sounds, what materials-like activities can we use to raise our students' awareness of pronunciation, especially these OUGH words? Now, I'm going to show you a maze. Some of you will immediately recognize it. So it is originally designed by Mark Hancock. And if you remember, Mark was one of the speakers at our conference last year. He's very kind to share his materials with the teaching community on his website, which I'm going to share with you in the chat later. Now, to set up this activity, you can paste the maze on a Google Jamboard. And ideally, you need at least 2 identical Jamboard files for 2 groups. And what's the task? First, the students are going to work in small teams, and they have to design a maze for other teams. So let's say we take the unvoiced f sound for the OUGH spelling. I'm going to call it the target sound from now on. First, you can divide your class in small teams. Ask them to decide on an escape route through the maze, like this. They can draw lines on Jamboard. Then each team is going to place some OUGH words with the target sound along the route. So you see there are 4 words there. And when this is done, you can ask your students to fill the remaining tiles with other OUGH words. But this time, make sure that the pronunciation is anything but the target sound. So once they're ready and you've checked their work, you can share them to a different team using link sharing. So for the purpose of this session, I've prepared a maze for you. Now, of course, you can adapt this for minimal pairs or differentiation between long and short vowels. So instead of us teachers giving it ready-made for our students, like another worksheet exercise, the students are going to be the ones who create their own versions of it. That's materials light. And in the design process, they have to consciously think about pronunciation in their heads. For example, does the OUGX spelling in a particular word carry the O or O sound? Finally, I'd like to add that's the benefit of gamification in this activity, like the interactive quiz, so you can add a bit of fun challenge to your lessons. And this activity makes it more palatable for your students to learn pronunciation. So over the past half an hour, we've been looking at 5 materials-like ideas for language practice. These activities cover grammar, vocabulary, speaking skills, functions, and phonology. As I suggested at the very beginning of this session, we're not abandoning course books or published materials at all. Instead, we ask our students to use them as a springboard for creating their own coursebook style activities. They'll be practicing language by doing something meaningful with it in a personalized way. And we've also seen that some activities take account of differentiated teaching. This ensures the relative success of all students in your mixed ability classes. So as teachers, if we're able to spend less time preparing materials in our lesson planning, we can use the time to look into the language point we're teaching and think about our students' specific needs. And I hope this should empower both your teaching and your students' learning. So I'm aware that it's 2 o'clock already. And Sarah, have I got time for question and answers?
Yep, sure you do.
Thank you.
So we invite you to put your questions in the chat box or in the question and answer box. Many people in the chat box are saying thank you for many of your practical ideas, Daniel.
Right. And thank you for listening. So I think we'll just end here if there are no questions. So everyone, thank you again for listening and coming to this conference. And I hope you've gained some extra ideas for running materials-like practice in your future teaching. Bye for now.